The night was colder than usual. The wind howled and the snow fell heavily, covering everything in a thick blanket of white. Through the large window of a modest house, the man watched the storm unfold. His eyes shifted from the raging wind to the faint figure outside, a German shepherd standing still in the deep snow, its breath visible in the freezing air. The dog had two small pups curled up underneath it, their fragile bodies barely noticeable against the snow. The shepherd's movements were slow, deliberate. Despite the freezing cold, the dog refused to leave the pups. It stayed huddled, her body trembling from the cold, but she made no attempt to move. The man stared at the scene, the sight of the dog's unwavering loyalty pulling at something inside him. His hands tightened around the warm cup of tea in his hands as he watched the shepherd shift slightly to cover the puppies with her own body. One of the pups, visibly weaker than the other, shivered uncontrollably. It couldn't even keep its eyes open, struggling to breathe in the bitter cold. The shepherd nudged the pup, trying to keep it warm, her body trembling with exhaustion. But she didn't move. The cold had begun to seep deep into her bones. He wanted to look away, to focus on something else, but he couldn't. His eyes kept coming back to the dog and the pups. A deep feeling of guilt gnawed at him. He could see their suffering, and yet he was unsure if he should act. He had been through so much loss before, and the idea of taking them inside, of letting them in, felt like a bigger decision than it should be. Could he even handle that responsibility? He had spent so long building walls around his heart that the idea of letting something or someone in seemed impossible. His hand hovered over the doorknob for a moment. He could open the door, let them inside. He could save them from this night. But what if they were dangerous? What if they brought disease or caused trouble? The question swirled in his mind, pulling him further away from the thought of opening the door. He glanced back at the window. The shepherd had shifted again, gently licking the face of the weaker pup, who was now barely moving. The storm outside seemed to grow harsher, the wind screaming against the house. His breath fogged up the window as he pressed his palm against it, staring at the scene. It was almost as if the dog was looking right back at him, pleading silently for help. The man's chest tightened. For a moment, the doubts seemed to vanish. He couldn't just leave them out there, but just as quickly, those walls he had built around his heart returned, reminding him of the pain he had felt before, of the losses he had suffered. He looked at the pup, barely clinging to life, and something shifted in him. It wasn't just the dog anymore. It was about something deeper. Something that had been buried for a long time. He knew he had to do something. But the hesitation was still there. What would happen if he opened the door? Would it change everything for him? The storm raged on, and the dog remained frozen in place. Time seemed to stand still as the man's internal struggle continued. Would he finally make the decision to open the door, or would he turn away, leaving them out there to face the cold alone? The storm outside raged with even more fury now. The howling wind shook the trees, sending snow swirling around the house in a dizzying dance. The man's hands trembled as he held the cup of tea, now lukewarm. He could no longer ignore the sound of the dog's soft whines, carried by the wind. It was as if the shepherd's plea was reaching him through the cold, and yet he remained frozen in his place. He turned back to the window. The dog was still standing there, her body shaking with the cold, but her eyes were locked on him. It was almost as if she was waiting for something, waiting for him to make a decision. The two puppies, too weak to move on their own, lay motionless beneath her, the smaller one shivering violently, its tiny body barely able to hold on to life. The man felt his heart twist as he looked at them. The shepherd's loyalty was undeniable. She had stayed out there despite the freezing cold, despite the storm, simply to protect her pups. He couldn't help but wonder if it was too late. The puppy, the sick one, hadn't moved in what felt like an eternity. Its small chest rose and fell erratically. His instinct screamed at him to open the door, to rush outside and bring them inside where they could be safe. But then another thought crept in. What if it was too late? What if the puppy had already given up? What if opening the door now would only make things worse? The man couldn't shake the fear that whatever decision he made, it might be the wrong one. As the man continued to watch, he saw the shepherd lower her head to the weaker pup, gently licking its face, trying to revive it, urging it to stay alive. The motherly instinct was so strong in her, and yet she too was on the verge of collapse from the cold. Her body was shaking with exhaustion, and yet she never let go of the responsibility. It was clear that if he didn't act soon, they might all be lost to the storm. The man's gaze shifted between the dog and the sick puppy. His heart ached as he watched the tiny pup fight for its breath. He didn't know what to do, but he could feel something inside him changing. This wasn't just about the dog or the pups anymore. This was about him, about confronting the walls he had built so carefully around his heart. Could he really just stand there, helpless, while they froze? He took a step toward the door, his hand reaching for the handle. For a moment, he paused. His breath hitched as the image of the sick puppy flashed in his mind. He knew that if he didn't do something soon, it might be too late. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest as the weight of the decision pressed down on him. Was he ready for this? Could he open up enough to save them? And then, with a deep breath, the man twisted the doorknob. The cold air rushed in as he swung the door open, and the world outside hit him with full force. Snow stung his face, but the sight that greeted him stole his breath away. There, standing in the snow, the shepherd and her two pups, their small bodies barely visible against the white blanket of snow, waiting. The shepherd's eyes met his, filled with a silent trust. She was no longer standing guard, no longer in survival mode. She had opened herself up to him, a silent plea for help. The man stepped outside, his heart racing. He knelt down, reaching out cautiously to the shepherd. She didn't hesitate. The dog stepped toward him, moving as if she knew he was the one to help. The pups too stirred, their small bodies trembling, their eyes weak but focused. As he reached out for the smaller puppy, the man felt the weight of the decision in that moment. This wasn't just about saving them. This was about saving himself too. The cold pierced the man's skin as he gently cradled the tiny puppy in his arms. It was so fragile, its little body stiff from the cold, barely able to hold on. His hands were shaking as he carefully wrapped the puppy in the warmth of his jacket, trying to protect it from the harsh wind. The shepherd watched him closely, her gaze steady, filled with an understanding he couldn't fully grasp. She wasn't just trusting him to save her pups. She was trusting him with a part of her heart, the part that had been willing to endure the storm just to keep them safe. The wind howled around them, but the man was determined. He could feel the puppy's shallow breaths against his chest, and he knew he had to act quickly. He stood up, keeping the puppy close, his eyes on the shepherd as he made his way back toward the house. The dog didn't follow immediately. She stood still for a moment, as if ensuring the second pup was okay before she moved. Then, with a soft whine, she followed him. The man rushed inside, closing the door behind him, and immediately knelt by the fireplace. He laid the puppy down gently on the floor, its small body still shaking. The warmth from the fire was a welcome relief, but the man could see that the puppy wasn't out of danger yet. He needed to act fast. He moved quickly to get a blanket, wrapping it around the fragile little body, hoping it would help bring the pup back to life. The shepherd entered the room slowly, keeping a watchful eye on her pups. She sniffed the air, then padded over to the puppy, gently nudging it with her nose. The man watched in awe as the dog's protective instincts took over. She had trusted him to help, but now she was taking over again, guiding him on what to do next. He couldn't help but marvel at the bond between the shepherd and her pups. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. The love between them was raw, pure, and unspoken. It was a bond that had survived the storm, the cold, and the unknown, and now it was thriving in this small, warm room. As the fire crackled, the man's heart began to soften. He had been so disconnected, so distant for so long, but here, in this room, with the shepherd and her pups, he felt something stir inside him, a warmth that had been buried for years. As the puppy began to show signs of improvement, the shepherd settled down beside it, her eyes never leaving the man. There was a sense of gratitude in her gaze, as if she understood that he had done something more than just open the door. He had allowed them to survive, and in doing so he had allowed himself to feel again. The second puppy, still shivering but not as violently as before, crawled over to join its sibling. The shepherd nuzzled them both, offering comfort and warmth. The man sat back, watching the scene unfold before him. It was a simple moment, but it felt like a miracle. He had saved them, yes, but in return, they had saved him too. The weight of his decision still lingered, but it no longer felt as heavy. In that moment, as the firelight flickered, he realized that opening the door had been the right choice. Not just for the dog and her pups, but for him as well. The world outside still roared with the storm, but inside there was peace. The man had opened his heart, and in doing so, he had found something he hadn't realized he was searching for. He glanced at the shepherd, who was now curled up next to her pups, the warmth from the fire bringing them all some comfort. She looked up at him once more, her eyes full of gratitude. For the first time in a long while, the man felt like he belonged, like he had done something meaningful. And as the puppies settled beside their mother, safe and warm, the man knew that this was just the beginning of a new chapter for all of them. The bond they had formed in those few moments was stronger than any storm could ever be. As the fire continued to crackle softly, the room felt warmer, not just from the heat, but from the presence of the shepherd and her pups. The storm outside, still raging, seemed a distant memory. In the peaceful silence of the room, the man sat quietly, watching the dogs slowly drift into a much-needed sleep. The puppies were now nestled against their mother, the warmth from the fire seeping into their small bodies, making them relax into a calm that had seemed impossible just hours before. But the man's mind was still racing. What had he just done? It felt like the simple act of opening the door had unlocked something deeper inside him. He had been so distant, so closed off from emotions for so long, but now he was beginning to understand something that had been buried for far too long. Helping the dog had changed him in a way he couldn't explain. It was as if he had been asleep for years, and these animals had woken him up. The shepherd, her head resting on her paws, glanced up at him. Their eyes met, and for a brief moment, it felt as if she understood everything he was feeling. She didn't need to speak. Her presence alone was enough. The trust that had been built between them in such a short time was unspoken, but undeniable. It was a bond that no amount of time could break. As the puppies slept peacefully, the man took a deep breath and realized just how important this moment was. He had opened his door to them physically, but in doing so, he had opened something within himself. He had allowed them in, not just into his home, but into his heart. And it was a heart that had been closed off for too long. The shepherd moved slightly, curling her body protectively around her pups, and the man's eyes softened as he watched them. He had made the right choice. He had saved them, but in return, they had given him something even more precious, a chance to heal. The storm outside still raged, but inside there was peace. The man stood up quietly, moving towards the door to make sure the storm hadn't worsened. As he opened it just slightly to peer outside, the wind howled again. But the warmth of the house wrapped around him, giving him a sense of comfort he hadn't known in a long time. The dogs were safe, and so was he. Turning back to them, he smiled softly. He didn't need to say anything. The look in the shepherd's eyes, the calmness of the pups, and the newfound peace within him were all the words he needed. He walked over to them, sitting on the floor beside the fire. He reached out slowly, his hand gently resting on the shepherd's fur, and for the first time in a long while, he felt like he wasn't alone. The puppy stirred in its sleep and nuzzled closer to its mother. The shepherd relaxed, her body finally able to rest, knowing her pups were safe. As the storm continued to rage outside, inside, there was nothing but warmth, healing, and the quiet promise of new beginnings. The days passed, and the storm eventually faded, leaving behind a quiet, calm winter morning. The man woke up early, the soft light of dawn spilling through the windows. As he sat up, he glanced over at the shepherd and her puppies, now fully settled in the warmth of the house. The pups, no longer frail and trembling, were now playful and full of life. Their little tails wagged with joy as they crawled toward him, eager for attention. The shepherd, though tired, was content, her eyes following the pups with gentle care. The man stretched, feeling the ache in his bones, but also something else, something lighter, something that hadn't been there before. He had been so used to keeping his distance from everyone and everything, but now, with these dogs in his life, it was as if the heaviness he had carried for years had begun to lift. The decision to open the door, to bring them in from the cold, had been more than just an act of kindness. It had been a turning point, not just for the animals, but for him as well. He stood up and moved toward the kitchen, the pups following him closely, their little paws making soft sounds on the wooden floor. The shepherd, ever the watchful mother, stayed behind for a moment, her eyes on her pups, but then she, too, rose and followed him, her steps slow but steady. As the man prepared a simple breakfast, he couldn't help but reflect on the events of the past few days. What had started as a hesitant decision, filled with doubts and fears, had turned into something unexpected. He had opened the door to save them, but in return, they had given him something he hadn't known he was missing: connection, warmth, and a sense of purpose that had eluded him for so long. The puppies now played at his feet, tugging at his shoelaces, their energy infectious. The shepherd looked up at him, as if silently thanking him for everything he had done. Her eyes were filled with something deeper than gratitude, something that felt like understanding, like she knew how much this moment meant to him. He crouched down, reaching out to pet the shepherd, and for the first time in what seemed like forever, he allowed himself to fully experience the moment. There was no rush, no fear, just the simple joy of being present with them. The puppies wiggled around him, their small bodies full of excitement, while the shepherd sat calmly by his side, her head resting on his knee. The man realized that this was what he had been searching for all along: connection, not just with the animals, but with himself. He had spent so much time hiding, avoiding the pain of the past, but now he felt something different. He felt alive, and he felt needed, in a way that was both humbling and beautiful. As the day went on, he continued to care for them, making sure the puppies were well fed and content. The shepherd, though protective, had grown to trust him fully. It was clear now that they weren't just guests in his home. They had become a family, and he had become part of theirs. When the evening came and the house settled into a peaceful quiet, the man sat by the fire once more, the dogs curled up around him. The storm had long passed, and so had the fears and doubts that had once consumed him. The shepherd and her pups had opened a door in his heart that he didn't know existed, and now he couldn't imagine life without them. The fire crackled softly, casting a warm glow on the room, and as the man watched the dogs sleep soundly, he smiled to himself. He had made the right choice, not just for them, but for himself, And in doing so, he had found something more precious than safety or comfort. He had found love, loyalty, and the promise of new beginnings, things he hadn't thought possible just days before. The man's heart was no longer closed off. It had been cracked open, not by any grand gesture, but by the simple act of opening a door. And now, with the shepherd and her pups by his side, he knew that no storm could ever change the warmth that had taken root in his life.